Well, this is a privilege of mine to be able to take us back to the Gospel of John. If you would take your Bibles, go back to John, but this time not to John 10. Join me in John chapter number 11 as we dive into I think is going to be a particularly helpful and meaningful passage for many of you in this room this morning. In the first service, I shared a little bit of my youth. I don't talk about my life or my upbringing that much in my sermons, and I certainly don't talk about my youth that much. But in the first service, for whatever reason during the music, I was thinking about a particular pet that I owned growing up. It was the family pet, not mine, but it was, the home pet. It was our dog. It was a black Labrador retriever, and a wonderful dog. We had him for nearly 22 years, and just a great, great dog. His name was Bubba, and this may date some of you. How many of you remember the movie Where the Red Fern Grows? You've seen that movie before? If you've watched that movie, you practically have watched my childhood. That movie reflects how I grew up very, very well. And I feel like I have lived multiple lifetimes in multiple types of generations. So I grew up very much backwoods, hillbilly kind of a child in the mountains of North Carolina. And I didn't have two dogs, I had one dog, and his name, like I said, was Bubba. That's a good North Carolina name. And Bubba was just the best dog ever. And he lived for such a long life because it seemed like he couldn't die. In fact, we were given the dog because the guy who owned him was raising hunting dogs, and he was training these dogs. And this particular dog, when he was young, got hit by a car, and so he didn't want to go through the time of waiting for its legs to be mended, healed again, and to see if it would be a sellable dog to hunters. And so he was given away. He was given to us. And so we kind of nursed him back to health, and he became a great family dog. But growing up in the woods like I did, he was constantly getting in trouble with coyotes and skunks and you name it, just every little critter and animal that would come along. He was very protective of the property, and so we were constantly bandaging him up or washing him down or taking care of him in some way or another year after year. And he was the type of dog that would find himself in trouble all the time. We didn't have close neighbors. All of our neighbors were very, very far spread apart from each other. And if you ended up in their property or in their woods, that was a big, big no-no. You don't do that. And they would guard their property very well. And Bubba, sometimes he would wander off into the neighbor's property. And one time he was running through the neighbor's woods and they shot him. But it was a clean shot, and he lived through it. And so we sewed him up and fixed him up and nursed him back to health, and he lived quite a bit much longer. And later on, he was hit by a car again, and this time he was hit pretty hard, and he was just gone for several weeks. And my mom was washing dishes one day and was looking out the front kitchen window and saw Bubba laying out in the front yard, and so we went to go check on him, and he was just a shell of the dog that he once was, just skin and bones, and he was eat up with maggots all over him. He was just death. And so we nursed him back to health. And he continued to get into problems and struggles with other dogs in the neighborhood. They would get into fights and things like that. And he would get squirt by the skunks like on a monthly basis, it seemed like. And that was just a constant problem that we would have. And we lived on a farm, and so the issues that with the other animals, that he was just constantly getting into troubles. And eventually we thought, man, this dog will live forever. And it doesn't matter if you shoot him or if you run him over with a car. It doesn't matter what you do to him. He can't die. Cats have 9 lives. How many lives do dogs have? He just kept going and living and living and living. So eventually we changed his name from Bubba to Lazarus, because it just seemed like he kept coming back from the grave. And well, unlike Lazarus, eventually he did die. He fell into a cave, actually, and broke his neck. I was traveling. By this time, I was old enough. I was traveling in ministry, and I was in Boulder, Colorado, doing some ministry training at the time, and I got the phone call that Bubba had died, which I thought was kind of a joke. You know, it's like, really? Like, dog, he can't die. He's Bubba. He's Lazarus. He can't die. But they weren't joking. He did. He died. And I wasn't there to be there for the funeral, because we gave all of our animals funeral. We actually had a cemetery up on the hill for chickens and pigs and dogs and all cats and every little hamsters, every little animal that died in our home would all get buried in the pet cemetery. And I wasn't able to be there for the funeral. But for whatever reason, while we were singing in the first service, that came to mind. And as you probably know the reason why now, because John chapter number 11 is all about the raising of Lazarus. But I want to kind of pause you from thinking that this entire chapter centers around a man named Lazarus that was raised from the dead. That's just not the case. This entire chapter is about Jesus. Jesus is the center of the story. It is about Jesus and how he relates to us, how he works with us, how he allows things to happen to us from time to time to grow us and to mature us and to strengthen us and to make us and conform us more into his image. And so the introduction to this chapter is going to lay the foundation for that. And I think we know a lot of these truths already, but in the moment of trial and tribulation, in the moment of living in the storms of life, we forget these lessons very quickly. Psalm 46 and verse number 1 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. We know that passage. We run to it. God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. So when I'm in that time of trouble, he's a very present help. He's a refuge. I can run to him and it'll be okay and everything will be all right. We know that mentally, intellectually, we know that. But then we forget it in the middle of the storm. When we're going through the trials and the tribulations and the time of trouble, we forget that he is still a present refuge. Romans chapter 8 and verse number 28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. We know these things. We know that whatever we face, if we're God's child and he loves us and we love him, that all things will work together for good. That in the end, it will bring glory to him and it will bring good into our life and that his purpose is being fulfilled. And in our minds, we know that. But in the moment and in the heat of the storm, we easily forget those things, don't we? It's easy to sit in our seats right now and to think that and to embrace that and to believe that. But the moment we're living in it, it's hard for it to be reality. And so this passage, if you're that type of person who's been living in a storm, who's been living under a rain cloud that's been following you around, and the trials and the tribulations and the testings and the struggles and the troubles of life are constantly weighing you down, this is the text for you this morning. And maybe you've been praying to God day in and day out, God, hear my pleas, and you're fasting and you're seeking him and you're praying to him and you're living your life for him and you seek to give him glory, and yet there's no answer and nothing has changed. And you might be questioning, where are you at, God? Or even worse, maybe you begin to look into yourself and think, well, what have I done? What sin am I sinning? What life immorality am I committing? And he's judging me. I'm being punished because he's not hearing me. He's not here. Where are you, God? Where are you at? Well, if that's where you find yourself this morning, you have made it to the right place, because this is the right text for you. And perhaps this is the right time for you to hear this text. It is the story of, you could say, what's left over of a family. Two sisters and a brother. It would appear that their parents have since passed, and they are living and struggling through life together in a small little village called Bethany. And that's where we're going to pick up in John chapter 11, verse number 1, if you'll look at it with me. Now, a certain man was sick. And this is, once again, this is another reason why I don't think that this chapter is about Lazarus. It introduces him as just a certain man, a certain person. The individual who's sick really isn't what's most important. What's most important is what Jesus is doing, what he is teaching, the lesson to learn from this certain sick man. Now, this man is Lazarus of Bethany. Now, there's two Bethanies. In chapter number 10, it ended with Jesus crossing the Jordan, going into Bethany. That's about, well, from where Jesus was at, that's about 25 to 26 miles away. This is a different Bethany. This is Bethany that's just right over the hill of the Mount of Olives. It's only about 2 miles outside of downtown Jerusalem. And so not very far away at all. And this is the Bethany that Jesus would have stopped at regularly as he would make his way to all of the feast, as he traveled up and down the Jordan River, anytime, because that was the typical route that they would follow. They would journey down the Jordan River, and then they would wind their way, working their way up the hill into Jerusalem. And generally speaking, you would crest over the Mount of Olives as you come down into the valley to come up to the gates of Jerusalem. And no doubt in my mind, Jesus loved to take that route because that route would take him over the Mount of Olives. And for most people during that time, that wouldn't have been particularly meaningful or special for them. Some of the Jewish scholars it would have been, because they would recognize from Old Testament passages that is where the dead would be raised to life. They would recognize that from certain prophets that is where the Messiah would descend to. And so it had significant meaning, still does today. In fact, if you're a Jew and you have millions and millions of extra dollars to spend, you can be buried right up on top of the Mount of Olives, and that they do that because they believe that when the Messiah returns that they will stand up and they will face him and see him. Of course, their Messiah did come and they rejected him already. Unfortunately, they will not be the ones being resurrected from the dead when he comes again. But nonetheless, Jesus would crest that hill time and time again. And for him, it had significant meaning. He knows that this is where he will return again. And when he sees the city the next time, Jerusalem, he won't be weeping over it. He won't be looking at it as a bunch of people who are lost, who have rejected safety. He talked of himself as kind of a hen wanting to take the chicks under his wings, but they refused him. They rejected him. And now the next time he comes, he will be descending down onto that mountain in great glory, in shining light. And he will remove sin, and he will remove death, and he will remove all enemies to him, and he will establish a kingdom that will last for 1,000 years and into eternity. So it had a lot of significant meaning to him, and because of that, Jesus no doubt loved to be able to stay in the home of Mary and Martha. And you've read about them in other Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke, where Mary would often sit at the feet of Jesus, gleaning and learning from his wisdom. Martha, being the kind of the workaholic, legalistic kind of background, she would be serving and working and complaining that her sister Mary is not helping her. And Jesus obviously using the opportunity to teach lessons. And this is a home that Jesus is very familiar with. And I want to reiterate here, as you look at verse number 2, it says, "It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick." Now Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, they are all close acquaintances with Jesus. I would say close friends with Jesus, based off the word that he uses in verse number 5. He's very close friends with these individuals. He's been in their home multiple times. They know him. He knows them very, very well. And Mary here, this is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is not Mary Magdalene. This is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Mary, the sister of Martha. This is the Mary that in chapter number 12, in the future, soon to come, she will anoint the feet of Jesus with expensive fragrant oil. So expensive, only 12 ounces of it. so expensive that it would cost a year's worth of wages to be able to buy it. And so she saved up, obviously, the money to be able to purchase it, and she pours all of it on his feet at one time, which makes Judas angry. And others begin to complain, this money could have been spent on the poor. And Jesus says, the poor are with you always, but I'm not always with you, and she has done this to anoint me for my burial, signifying that he's going to die soon. But what it also signifies is this. Mary she did not follow Jesus like everyone else just because he did perform miracles and he could feed them and take care of them and heal them. She genuinely loved him. Martha genuinely loved him. Lazarus genuinely loved Jesus. So much so that they were willing to sacrifice great wealth in order to worship him and to glorify him. And it says here that Lazarus, her brother, was sick. And this must be sickness that they could tell already was getting to the point of death. There's nothing else that we can do. We need to find Jesus. We need to reach out to him and get help. So she sends a messenger to Jesus that Lazarus is sick. Verse number 3 says, "Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." The word love there is phileo. This is the Greek word for deep friendship. This is the one whom you have a deep friendship with, the one whom you love. He's sick. Now, she didn't presume to give him any instructions. Heal him immediately. Speak the word and it will be done. She just said, you need to know he's bad sick. I also want you to see this, that Jesus really does love them. This is not just Mary and Martha saying that. It's true. He really does love them. Verse number 5 says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." He really does love them deeply, as he does all of his own children. In chapter 13 and verse number 1 it says, "Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Jesus loves all of his children. He loves all those who are his, all the way to the end, all the way to the cross. Now, why am I emphasizing all of this? I'm emphasizing the fact that they loved him. They were sacrificially living for him. They worshiped him. They followed him. They obeyed him. They glorified him. And he loved them mutually. He loved them. And they're praying to him because they're sending a messenger. By the way, Jesus is about 20 miles away from where they're at, so it took this messenger about a day's journey to get to Jesus. And so they sent a messenger to Jesus to tell him Lazarus is sick, and so that's their way of praying. Send this petition to Jesus so that he would know how our brother is doing. So there's clear evidence that they love Jesus, and Jesus loves them. And even when he hears the messenger, look at verse number 3 at the end of it. "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." And when Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." It seems that Jesus is reassuring their hearts, or at least the messenger's heart, that this is not unto death. This will be for the glory of God. Now you need to pay attention to the words here because he says it's for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Through this thing that's happening, I will be glorified and God in heaven will be glorified. Through this thing. Not around it, not skipping it, but through it, God will get glory in this. I will be glorified in this. Now, the interesting thing is this. It seems like it's a done deal. We love him, he loves us. There's a reassurance that everything's going to be okay. It's not unto death. God will be glorified in the end. We'll all be happy. It's going to be a blessed thing. And it's not like the wicked of the world Not like the sinners of the world. I was thinking of Psalm 1 this morning when I was reading this passage. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Psalm 40 and verse number 4, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. You would think that Mary and Martha, and certainly by this point, the messenger, are all thinking the same thing. We follow God. We're not the ungodly. We're doing what's right. And we're seeking Jesus. And we're magnifying the Messiah. And we're worshiping and serving Him. Everything will be fine for us. We'll be like trees planted by the rivers of water. We'll be taken care of. All of our needs will be supplied for. That's the feeling. And we feel that way, don't we? I love God. I serve God. I try to live my life for God. God's going to take care. Whatever happens in the days ahead, He'll take care. He'll be there, no matter what. But as I had mentioned on Easter Sunday morning, God always puts plot twists in the story, and verse number 6 is where that plot twist changes. Verse number 6 says, So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Lazarus is deathly sick. He hears the messenger. He responds to the messenger. And then he sits around where he's at for 2 more days. He doesn't do anything. He's absent. And as you read later on in the text, as you all know, Lazarus ends up in the tomb. And Jesus eventually comes around and He's going to resurrect him from the dead. But Mary tries to stop him and says, Oh, no, Lord, but it's been 4 days. He probably stinks by now. So at least 4 days has passed since his death. So that means that it took at least a day for the messenger to travel to where Jesus was at. And then Jesus sits for 2 more days. And then decides that he's going to go to Bethany, and so he travels another day. And so there you have 4 days. So 4 days eventually will pass. And in all likelihood, if you do the math here, in all likelihood, by the time the messenger shows up to tell Jesus that Lazarus is sick, he's probably already dead. Lazarus was probably already dead when the messenger told Jesus that he was sick. And here in this story, it seems like he's doing nothing. That nothing is going on. And you can imagine probably Mary and Martha back home are thinking, where is he? Where was he at? And of course, they say that later on as you read through the rest of the chapter. Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. We called for you. We asked for you. Where were you at? Just a couple of verses later, Mary will be talking to Jesus too, and she'll tell him, Lord, if you had been here, this would not have happened. Where were you at? We called for you. We prayed. You healed all these other people. We have heard the stories of those that you have resurrected from the dead. Just recently, you gave sight to a man that was born blind who didn't even know who you were. We're your close friends. How could you allow this to happen? Why did you allow this to happen? Why were you absent? I thought you knew all things. We've heard you talk. We've heard you teach. We've seen the things that you've said and you've done. We know that you are omnipotent. We know that you obviously knew about this. Where were you at? Verse number 7 says, Then after this, he said to his disciples, Let's go to Judea. Remember, once again, he's on the other side of the Jordan, outside of the Sanhedrin's jurisdiction. So he says, let's go to Judea. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? You already said that Lazarus' sickness isn't to death. Why put yourself in harm's way? Don't go to Jerusalem. They're going to kill you. They're going to arrest you. They're looking for you. There's a warrant for your arrest. They're asking people for any evidence. Don't do this. They're going to stone you to death. Or worse, they're going to crucify you. Look at verse number 9. Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. Now you're probably thinking the same thing that the disciples were thinking when he said this. What in the world does that mean? What does that have to do with going to Jerusalem and Lazarus? Why do you always talk to us in riddles? It's like, what is this all about? Now, this is not new. Jesus had already said something very similar to this. They just forgot it already. And he said this literally just about 2 months earlier. In chapter number 9, if you would go there, chapter 9, verse number 1, and I've already referenced this, the healing of the blind man. He was born blind. And in John chapter 9, verse number 1, it says, Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now this is relevant even for our passage that we're looking at today. You see, the disciples looked at the trouble that this blind man was going through, the life and the trials and tribulations that he was facing, and their immediate assumption was somebody sinned. Somebody did something wrong. Either he did something wrong, or maybe his parents did something wrong, but somebody's at fault. Somebody sinned, and he's being judged because of it. Well, I can imagine maybe even Mary and Martha, after they had put their brother in the tomb and began to sit down and reflect on the situation, thinking, well, Jesus practically ignored us, and I thought we were close friends, and we asked him to help, and he didn't do anything. Did we sin? Is there something wrong with us? Did I offend him? Did I do something that he's judging me for? Now, the Bible doesn't say that that's what was going on in their mind, but naturally we gravitate to that a lot of times, don't we? We kind of, when God's not hearing, when God's not there, when God's not answering the prayer, then we start to look at ourselves. It's like, well, God, his ears are closed. Is it me? Did I do something, God? Are you ignoring me because of some sin that I did? The answer that Jesus gives in verse number 3 is neither. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Once again, Jesus has already talked this type of language to them before. They didn't understand it then. They don't understand it now. The point is this. Jesus is the light of the world. This is what John chapter 1 and verse number 4 says. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Jesus is the light of men. In John chapter 8 and verse number 12, Jesus himself said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. I am the light of life. And the point that Jesus is making to his disciples over and over again is this. As long as I am living in this world, those of this world, they have a glimpse of the light of God. They can see the light of God in the words that I say, in the actions that I do, in the miracles that I perform, in the signs that I present. As long as I am here, there is light. As long as I am able to perform these things in front of them, they can see that God is among them, that the light of God is being presented to them. And the more light that they see, the more they are around that light, and the more of that light that they take in, that will protect them in the days ahead from stumbling in the darkness. Because eventually that light will be removed from this world, and whatever is left behind in their minds and their hearts is what will protect them and keep them strong. One of the greatest evidences of the truthfulness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is how the disciples acted after his crucifixion. All of them were willing to be martyrs. All of the early church was willing to be martyrs for the cause of Christ. Why? Because they saw the light of Jesus Christ. They were witnesses of his resurrection. They were witnesses of his truth and of his gospel. And that protected them from stumbling. And so, if you'll go back to chapter number 11 there, he says in verse number 11, "These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up." I didn't mention this in the first service, but all throughout the Scriptures, both in the Old Testament, New Testament alike, those that are part of the family of God, whenever death is referred to them, it's always referred in the idea of sleeping. This is not true for those that are not part of God's kingdom, not part of God's children. But for those that are God's children, death is always looked at as nothing more than sleep. You're just resting until you are awoken again with your new glorified body. And so Jesus says, I go to wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. They thought, well, you already said that he's not going to die. And if he's sleeping, then that sounds like that's a good sign. Maybe he'll get some rest and he'll recover. There's no need for you to put yourself in harm's way. There's no need to... the authorities, no doubt, will be watching their home because you have a close relationship with them. You're going to get arrested. Don't do that. Jesus makes it very plain to them in verse 14. He tells them, Lazarus is dead. This is another sign of his deity, by the way. He's 20-some miles away. How does he know that Lazarus is dead? Because he's omnipotent. Because he knows all things. He tells them Lazarus is dead. And then verse number 15, all Christians must come to terms with verse 15. And this is the key this morning. All of us at some point must understand this verse and how it is at some point going to apply to your life. Jesus said, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there. Now, it's easy for us to read that and to somewhat comprehend it 2,000 years later in a story of the past. But when that same truth is applied to your life, it's much harder for you to grab a hold to. Jesus says, Lazarus died, and I ignored the request from his sisters to heal him. And I'm glad that I wasn't there. I'm glad that I didn't answer the prayers. I'm glad I didn't rush off and leave the moment they wanted me to. I'm glad that I wasn't there for your sakes. Now notice, once again, everything is about God doing something in their life. They're going to go through something. He's going to test them in something. He's going to allow something. But it's all for their sake. And once again, in our practical life, this would be very difficult for us to grab a hold of. Let's say you've been praying for years for something. Like, Lord, please answer. I beg you, Lord. I'm fasting. I'm seeking your face. I'm serving you. I'm doing everything that I can think to do. And God says, I'm glad that I'm not answering your prayer. And your response to God might be, but why? I don't see how you're getting any glory in this. Even Mary and Martha, by this point, the messenger has now made it back to their home, and he's delivered the message to them. Jesus said that Lazarus will not die, but this will be for the glory of God, and they have to break the news to them, but he has already died. And then the question is why would he say that? How's God glorified in Lazarus' death? He made a mistake. I thought he was God. Does God make mistakes? You see, once again, you have to understand that sometimes God allows you, like Joseph, to be in the dungeon for quite some time before he could use that for means of great glory and salvation of others. Sometimes God will allow you, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to go through the fire so that when you are taken out of the furnace, that you will be able to stand firmer and more diligently than ever before for the glory of God. Sometimes God will allow you to go into the ark and go through the 40 days and 40 nights of storms and devastation on the earth so that on the backside of it, you can replenish the world and do great things for the glory of God. Sometimes God will say, I am not going to rescue you from this situation that you're in. No, instead, you will spend the night in the lion's den. And as you go through that, I will use you to reach many for me. There are a plurality of stories that I could share from scriptures in regards to this truth. We all know this. This is a truth that emerges over and over and over and over again in the scriptures. God allows hurt. God allows pain. God allows suffering. God allows trouble. Why? For your sake. I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. That's the whole point. That you will learn to believe. He will allow such hurt and pain and agony and suffering in your life to the point to where you have no hope outside of Him. There are no options, there are no choices, there are no plan Bs. There is nothing that can be done except God intervenes in some miraculous way. And when He does, your faith moves to a whole other level. You begin to believe in Him like never before. You can see His hand at work. You can understand His plan on the backside of it. He says, I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to Him. So Jesus tells His disciples, there is a lesson for you to learn. For these 12 disciples that are following Him, says, you do not believe me well enough. I'm going to show you something that is going to cause you to believe me better. And for the lesson that Mary and Martha is going to learn, it's the same lesson. We'll see it again next week as we dive back into this text. But I want to close with one verse. If you'll go back to chapter 11 and verse number 1. Verse number 1 says, now a certain man was sick, Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is a short form of a Hebrew name, Eleazar. And both Eleazar and Lazarus mean the same thing. The name of Lazarus' name means this: God helps. God helps. It's a very fitting name for the story, isn't it? When it seems like God is not going to help, when it feels like God is not there, when everything points to He has abandoned me, God is still our help. Maybe Jesus is looking to you like He did with Peter one day, and He says, are you going to abandon me like everyone else has? And Peter's response to Him is, Lord, where else can we go? You have the words of eternal life. There's nowhere else to run. There's no other salvation. There's no other help. It's you. And I don't understand anything you're saying, and I don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You just ran off everybody. I don't know why you did that. But I'm learning to trust you. This is why a little bit later on we like to pick on Peter as he steps out of the boat and begins to walk in the water. And then he begins to see the waves and the storm around him and he sinks. And Jesus reaches in His hand into the water and pulls him out because Peter says, Lord, save me. And we like to look at that story and think of Peter as such a person of little faith. But would you step out of the boat and walk on water? Would you have even begun that? You see, Peter, over a process of time, had got to the point to where even in the storm of life, even on a lake, He had come to believe in Jesus enough to say, can I walk out with you? And of course, there is no point in our life and there is no storm in our life in which we don't need the hand of God to carry us all the way through it. And you'll never be able to walk on water forever by yourself. You'll never be able to go through the storm by yourself. You'll never be able to live through a night with the lions by yourself. You'll never be able to walk through the fiery furnace by yourself. You'll never be able to survive 40 days and 40 nights of a flooding world by yourself. But when your hand is firmly grasped on Christ, He will bring you through it. And you might feel like when you can't see Him, where are you at and why are you allowing this to happen and how could this possibly be bringing you glory? You haven't come through the storm yet, and you don't see the light on the other side, and you don't know His great plan. He has a great plan. Ultimately, we have to be patient and let Him work it out to see His glory through it. Maybe you're downtrodden this morning, but it's only because you haven't gotten through it yet. You just keep your eyes on Him. Hang on to Him. Grab a hold of Him and get through it so that on the other side you see the glory of Christ and you see the work that He was doing in your life. My psalm this morning, I read this earlier when you guys sung this song. I didn't pick this verse for the song that you guys were singing. This was my psalm this morning. Psalm 81 in verse number 7 says, "You called in trouble, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah." Selah. Sometimes God allows you to go through the storm, but in that storm, He says, those troubled times I will deliver you, and I will answer you in the secret place. There are times when we have to go through the storm, and in our secret place, we trust Him. We rely on Him. We look to Him. Maybe that's where you're at this morning. Maybe this text is what you needed this morning. And if that's the case, I want to give you a moment to just pray and say, Lord, I don't know where you're at. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you've allowed all this to happen. But I'm going to trust your word. I'm going to trust you. And I'm going to look to you to get me through this storm, no matter how hard it may be. I trust you. Let's pray.